Hello and welcome. Awash in oil, yet still destitute. It's a problem Nigeria has been struggling with for half a century. In spite of generating more than $600 billion over those past 50 years, Nigeria's oil industry seems to benefit only a few. The country is more strategically positioned than ever in a resource-hungry world, as it's now among the top 10 oil-producing nations in the world, but corruption, inefficiency and underdevelopment have held back its potential. The situation is made worse by uprisings in the Niger Delta, where most of the liquid gold, as it's known, is located. What real motivation is there to change the circumstances that hold back the majority of the people of Africa's most populous nation? On this show, we look at Nigeria's so-called resource curse and examine the prospect for a more equitable system for the oil wealth. Joining me for our discussion from Los Angeles is the renowned Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka. Considered by many to be one of the greatest writers out of Africa, he was placed in solitary confinement for his mediation efforts during Nigeria's civil war. His 2006 memoir is entitled "You Must Set Forth at Dawn." Dr. Soyinka has remained an outspoken critic of many Nigerian administrations. And from New York, we're joined by photojournalist and filmmaker Ed Kashi. His new book, Curse of the Black Gold, 50 Years of Oil in the Niger Delta, takes an unflinching look at Nigeria's oil industry. I welcome you both to the show.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. And Dr. Soyinka, if I could start by asking you to what extent you feel that perhaps the Niger Delta is a forgotten story. I mean, as far as the world knows, as far as the world's concerned, it's largely been ignored. Why do you think that's the case? And essentially, I guess, why is it so important?
Well, I don't think it's a deliberate act of insisting that what's going on there is not a reality. I think it's an embarrassment, because what is happening in the Delta today points a finger of guilt in so many directions. And for me, of course, the primary is within Nigeria itself, and what Nigerian leaders have made of this incredible opportunity, and but however at the expense of some of the people within the Delta region. And then of course the oil exploration companies, with their contempt for basic minimum standard of conduct towards the areas, the indigents, from whom this wealth is being dredged. So I think very often I feel it's a matter of embarrassment, a guilt feeling. And so they pretend, well, it's just a few people, restless and violent and kidnapping and so on, whereas this problem goes back decades.
Now, Ed Kashi, your book has some very candid pictures in it and gives an indication of how difficult life can be there. Tell me about that book, how it came together, what you saw, and really what life is like for people in the Niger Delta.
Well, I became acquainted with the Niger Delta story in 2004 through Michael Watts, a professor at Berkeley, and he invited me to join him on a visit there. And as soon as I went there, I was really overtaken with every sense of what was going on there. And for me, this was one of the most graphic examples of economic and social injustice that I had ever seen anywhere in the world. I had just been working in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so for me, this sort of caught my attention, and as a journalist, as a photojournalist, I felt a tremendous need to document what I did feel, especially coming from the West, was an untold story. And then as I've gotten more deeply into the subject, I've come to understand the sort of intimate relationship that the consumers of energy in the United States have to the people who live in the Niger Delta.
Now, we showed some of the pictures there as you were talking of the powerful pictures you took, and I noticed while going through the book some of the sort of disastrous environmental consequences from the mismanagement of the region, or at least what's said to be the mismanagement of the region. And I wonder, how did you pick the shots that you chose to portray what the message you were trying to get across?
Well, working in the Niger Delta is one of the toughest places in the world, particularly as a photojournalist, to work. The military, the government, and the oil companies really don't want people like me there. And so as much as I might have a wish list of the subjects and the scenarios that I wanted to document, often it was sort of whatever I could get, and that sort of ruled the day. But it was very important to me to show the lack of development for the people who live there. It was very important for me to show the environmental degradation. And it was really important and very difficult to show the oil infrastructure. It's very hard to get access to the oil companies.
Well, Dr. Soyinka, we've got an email that came in from Zimbabwe, if I may put this to you, sir. It says, and it's from Tutukani Micheze, who says, it's about ownership. The oil companies control exploration, pumping and exporting. They make large profits and do not reinvest in Africa. When compared to the Arab Gulf, the difference is obvious. Nigeria's lack of development results from the oil companies. Now, I know you mentioned the basic minimum standards that some of these companies adhere to, but I wonder, do you feel that the blame does lie fairly heavily on the shoulders of these companies, as many people do?
Well, you know, companies can only get away with what they are allowed to get away with by the leadership of the oil-producing areas. If you have an honest leadership with a sense of, you know, basic dignity, the right of ownership, which of course belongs basically to the people from whom the wealth is extracted. If you have that sense of responsibility, of just basic moral integrity in the leadership, the oil companies cannot exploit the people of that area. They cannot get away with this substandard conduct. Oil spillage, degradation, decades of oil flaring which kills fauna, which pollutes ancient fishing ponds, which pollutes, absolutely degrades the soil to the extent that normal organic means of earning a living, like farming, becomes impossible. If you have a leadership which is responsible to its own people, they will not allow foreigners to get away with so much. So I'm sorry, basically I always insist that this has been a fault, a very glaring flaw, treachery of leadership towards their own people. Then we come to the guilt, the responsibility of the oil-producing areas who have such contempt with the third world, for the third world country that they engage in practices which would not be tolerated by other societies, European, Asian, or Arab.
Now, Ed Kashi, you know, I've done interviews with the oil companies before and put to them the issue of the treatment of people in the Niger Delta. And I have to ask you, their response often is that, well, if it wasn't for their presence, there wouldn't be many of the schools, medical facilities, that they end up supporting the social infrastructure. And I wonder if you saw any evidence of that in your work there.
You know, I saw very little evidence of that, and first of all, I could not agree more with what Dr. Soyinka just said. He touches on all the points and cuts to the heart of it, and I do feel that it's the Nigerian government who bears the greatest responsibility. You can put blame on the oil companies for a lack of investment or almost a cynical use of the land to extract this resource. I mean, it is amazing to me that in 50 years, the oil companies have not opened one technical institute to train local people to work in their industry. You know, I'm a small businessman, so I can't imagine the scale that the oil companies work on. But to me, that just seems like bad business practice, besides being sort of morally repugnant. So while I have tremendous issues with the oil companies, and I have not seen a lot of evidence of schools, you know, they claim to build schools, they claim to build docks or quays for the boats, because it's mostly a boating area, water supply, electricity. Quite often, those projects become orphaned or are not completed. But ultimately, it's the Nigerian government that is responsible for the people, for the land, and for the resources.
Dr. Soyinka, an email that we had from regular viewer Paul Avali in Norwich in the UK says, when Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed, the role of the international oil was highlighted, and it became clear that negative publicity could prompt these companies to clean up their acts. But now it doesn't look like much has changed. Are ordinary Nigerians any better off? And I wonder, I mean, has there been any why has this persisted for so long without being addressed thoroughly?
Yes, there is a great deal of complacency. At the time, people felt, in the international community to some extent, felt this crime which was committed against representatives of the Nigerian people, the defenders of the ecology, the protectors of the rights of indigenous people, Ken Saro-Wiwa and his companions, that when this crime was committed under such a public global glare that it would compel the oil companies to tidy up their act. And to some extent, it did for a short while. But I think that they become complacent once again. Let me emphasize this. I mean, I have been in that region. I've flown over that area. I have taken the powered canoes through the areas. In fact, I led a kind of advanced guard of the Nobel laureates, which concerned itself with what was happening in the Delta region, and actually put it on the agenda for the year. And I was part of that team. And we went there under the protection of the militants over there, went through the creeks. I visited Oloibiri. Oloibiri was where the first pipe was sunk and the first oil was withdrawn. And it is heartbreaking. 50 years afterwards, what is Oloibiri today? Just another little rural creek village, degraded, oil pools everywhere. Well, a few token schools here, one clinic or two in that whole area. We toured the entire Niger Delta region. And believe me, for anyone to say that the level of social, physical, infrastructural development in that area compared with the wealth that has been taken out of that region, which has benefited a series of politicians, military leaders in particular, who collaborated with the oil companies, to compare that amount of wealth with the level of development in that area, pointing to just a few schools here and there, is such a cynical claim that it isn't even worth serious attention.
Well, before we take a break, let's squeeze in a call from Pakistan, and we've got James on the line. James is actually from Nigeria, but in Pakistan. James, thanks for joining us. Your question, please.
What I want to say is the problem in Niger Delta is something that has to do with someone in a conference of sovereignty, to actually talk this thing out. Because the issue of militancy, actually, on the part of the militants, will solve this issue. And I also believe that it has a great role to play. I know they are doing a great job in the NDDC form and things and other things,
Okay.
But really, when you look into the statistics, you look at Nigeria has the highest number of...
James, let me put that to Dr. Shoyinka, that I think from what James was saying, there was a very bad line, but he was talking about the issue of the Niger Delta being an issue of sovereignty and the way it's being handled.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he has a point, and I know what he's getting at. The Niger Delta situation has reached a point where it must be treated in a holistic way. In other words, in the context of what is Nigeria, what constitutes Nigeria, what are the protocols of association between the various regions? How do you actually address the issue of resource control? In other words, do you say all the resources should go to the center, and then the center doles out what it wants or what it negotiates under circumstances which are not really equal, which are not egalitarian, what it considers appropriate to the various regions, or it says let each section under a genuine federal system control its own resources and pay taxes, dues, payment for common services, etc. to the center, so that the center is not just fattening itself on the sweat and the loss of various regions like the Delta region. That is what he's talking about. And it's quite right. The Delta region issue has got to be treated also globally in the entire context of what is Nigeria? How does it hold together? How does it operate? How does it control resources regionally, sectionally? And what rights has the center over the genuinely productive areas of Nigeria? That's the point he's making, and I agree with him.
All right, well, we're going to take a very short break here, gentlemen. I ask you not to go away. More on discussion of Nigeria's oil wealth coming up after this short break.